The storm that ended Nora Whitfield Marsh's old life and began her new one arrived without warning on the night of August 23rd, 1891. Not as lightning, not as the slow green darkening of sky that Crawford County farmers had learned to read the way other men read newspapers. It came as pressure, as a wall of moving air so dense and so fast that the weather vane on the barn spun twice and snapped off its post before anyone understood what was happening. Nora was 29 years old. She had been a widow for 5 months. When the wind began to scream across the ridge at 9 o'clock that evening, she did what every instinct she possessed told her to do. She pulled 7-year-old Silas from his bed, wrapped him in the quilt his grandmother had sewn from Caleb's old work shirts, and carried him toward the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. Briar came with them. The dog had been Caleb's, a lean, deep-chested hound with a coat the color of iron ore gray-brown with flecks of rust along the muzzle. Since Caleb's death in March, Briar had not left Nora's side for more than the time it took to eat. The dog understood something that Nora herself was still learning, that the shape of a family could change, but the obligation of that family to hold together could not. In the root cellar in the darkness that smelled of earth and old potatoes, and the ghost of every summer that had ever been put up in jars, the three of them pressed together and listened to the world come apart above them. Silas had his face buried in the dog's neck. Nora had her arms around both of them. And the sound of it was nothing like any storm Nora had survived in her 29 years on this earth. It was not the roar of a tornado. She had heard that twice, once as a girl in her father's cellar, and once 6 years ago on this very farm with Caleb crouched beside her, his hand over hers. A tornado sounds like a locomotive bearing down on you, unstoppable and singular. This was different. This was wider, flatter, more patient, as though the wind were not passing through but had decided to stay. Had decided that Crawford County, Arkansas was exactly where it intended to be, and it would rearrange things accordingly. And then beneath the roaring, she heard the other sound. It began as a crack sharp and clean like a rifle shot. Then another. Then a third. And then they came so fast they stopped being individual sounds and became a kind of continuous tearing, a ripping of something large and old and irreplaceable from the earth that held it. It lasted 11 minutes. Nora knew because she counted. Not in any methodical way, not looking at a watch, but in the way the mind fixes on one thing to keep itself from shattering. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted the seconds between the worst of the sounds and found they were not seconds at all. They were too close together. The destruction was too efficient. 42 years of growing, 42 years of root and wood, and the slow, patient accumulation of everything this land had to offer, and it came undone in 11 minutes. When the wind finally let go of Crawford County, when the pressure in the air equalized and the silence returned in that eerie, absolute way that always follows a great storm, Nora waited another full minute before she opened the cellar door. The farmhouse still stood. The barn stood. The chicken coop had lost half its roof, and the hens were huddled in the far corner with their eyes gone wide and strange in the lantern light. But they were alive. The well had not been touched. The fence along the north pasture had lost 3 sections of rail, but the posts held. She walked to the back of the house. She raised the lantern, and she saw 31 black walnut trees lay on the south-facing slope behind the farmhouse, and every single one of them had fallen in the same direction, northeast. Their massive root systems had torn free of the earth in great circular wounds, each one a perfect raw socket in the hillside packed with red Arkansas clay and the pale thread-like fingers of smaller roots that had nothing left to hold. The crowns of the trees had tangled together as they fell, the long, straight trunks coming to rest parallel across the slope in an arrangement so regular, so methodical, that it looked less like destruction than like something deliberate, as though the storm had not come to ruin the grove, as though it had come to reorganize it. Silas stood beside her, his small hand in hers, the quilt still around his shoulders. Briar pressed against the boy's legs. None of them spoke for a long moment. Then Silas looked up at her with his father's eyes gray-green, serious, already working at the problem, and said the only thing there was to say. "Mama, Grandpa Ezra's trees." "Yes," Nora said. She kept her voice steady. She had learned in the last 5 months that the voice was something you could control even when nothing else was. "Grandpa Ezra's trees." She put her arm around her son, and they stood together looking at the grove, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. $400. That was what the trees had been worth standing. The county assessor had told her this in May when she had asked him to value the property for tax purposes 2 months after Caleb's death, when she was still moving through her days in the fog of grief and practicality that follows sudden loss. He had walked the slope with his notebook and his careful eyes, and he had told her $400 for the timber alone. More than the farmhouse, more than the barn and the tools and the livestock and the 80 acres of Rocky Hill land combined. It had been Silas's inheritance. It had been her security. It was the reason she had refused, despite the advice of every well-meaning neighbor and every sympathetic deacon at the Crawford County Methodist Church, to sell the farm and move into Van Buren with her cousin and find some quieter, safer way to raise her son. She had refused because of the trees, and now the trees were lying on the ground. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the bed she had shared with Caleb in the room where his coat still hung on the peg by the door, because she was not yet ready to move it, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about money. $14 in the tin box under the bed. Property taxes due January 1st, $35. The loan Caleb had taken from Crawford County Savings in February before he got sick, when he had thought the spring was going to be good and the market for hickory was going to be strong. $40 due March 1st. $75 total. She had 14. And somewhere on the south-facing slope behind her house, 31 trees were lying on the ground in the dark, waiting for morning and for whoever would come first to tell her what they were worth now that they could not stand. She knew who would come first. Everyone in Crawford County knew who would come first. She was right. Warren Holt arrived on the third morning after the storm. He came in a wagon pulled by 2 draft horses. Big roans matched well-fed, the kind of animals that announced their owner's prosperity before he said a word. His son Preston rode beside him, 24 years old, with his father's square jaw and none of his father's patience, wearing a smirk he hadn't bothered to compose before stepping down from the wagon. Nora was on the porch when they pulled up the rutted drive. She was scrubbing clay from Silas's boots with a brush in a bucket of well water, and she did not stop when she heard the wagon. She finished the boot she was working on, set it aside, and stood. Warren Holt was 54 years old. He had operated the largest sawmill in Crawford County for 19 years, which meant he had opinions about wood, the way a minister has opinions about scripture, frequently loudly, and with the unshakable certainty of a man who has never seriously entertained the possibility of being wrong. He was not a cruel man, not in any simple sense. He genuinely believed that what he was about to offer Nora Whitfield Marsh was a kindness. That was in some ways the most dangerous thing about him. He stepped down from the wagon with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned to carry his weight thoughtfully. He removed his hat. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, that particular combination of sympathy and calculation that men deploy when they believe a woman does not understand the value of what she owns. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "terrible thing about the Grove. Terrible thing. I heard about it in town yesterday, and I said to Preston, here I said we ought to go see if the widow Marsh needs any help." Nora set down the scrub brush. She did not offer him water. She did not invite him to sit. She stood on her porch with Briar at her side. The dog had taken an immediate, incomprehensive dislike to Warren Holt, a low, continuous sound in his chest that Nora felt more than heard, and she waited. Warren Holt was not a man who required invitation. He walked to the base of the porch steps and looked up at her and said, "I'll give you $8 for the timber." The number landed in the air between them like something dropped from a height. $8 for 31 black walnut trees that had been assessed at $400. Behind his father, Preston made a sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was more refined than that, more controlled, but it carried the same information a laugh would have. He had his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he was looking at the hillside with the proprietary interest of a man surveying something that he already considered his. $8, Nora said. $8 is fair, Warren said, and his voice had taken on the patient instructional quality that she imagined he used when explaining obvious things to slow students. "More than fair, if I'm being honest with you. That wood is green, Mrs. Marsh. It's heavy. It'll take weeks to haul and months to season before it's any use to anyone. And by the time I can actually sell it, I'll have more money tied up in that timber than I'm likely to get out. I'm doing you a service here, taking a burden off your hands." He paused. The sympathy in his expression was real. She was certain of that. He had constructed a version of this situation in his mind in which he was the reasonable man, the generous man, the man doing the widow a favor by taking her trouble off her hands before it became something worse. And beyond the timber, he continued, I'd also be willing to consider the property itself, the land and the buildings together. $200 and you could move to Van Buren, find yourself a proper situation, a room somewhere comfortable closer to family. You have a boy to think about, Mrs. Marsh. This is a lot of ground for one woman to work alone. The land was worth $600 at minimum. Nora knew this because Caleb had told her, and Caleb had never lied to her about money. He had never lied to her about anything. No, she said. Warren Holt blinked. No, she said again. I won't sell the timber at $8. I won't sell the land at $200. I won't sell anything today. Warren's expression shifted. The sympathy stated it was too much a part of him to disappear quickly, but something harder moved in behind it. Mrs. Marsh, that timber is worth nothing where it lies. Every mill in this county is backed up for months with storm damage. Nobody's going to haul green walnut when there's oak and hickory available closer to hand. By the time anyone has room to think about walnut, that wood will have checked and cracked and split, and it'll be worth even less than I'm offering now. He let the pause breathe. Same as the timber, the offer won't improve with age. Briar's low sound had become a growl proper. Nora put her hand on the dog's neck, not to silence him, but to acknowledge that he was right. Get off my land, Mr. Holt. Warren held her gaze for a long moment. Then he settled his hat back on his head, and the sympathy in his face arranged itself into something that might have been pity. You'll come back to me before Christmas, he said. When the taxes come due and the snow falls, and you realize you can't work this place alone. And when you come, the offer will be the same. $8 for the timber, $200 for the wagon. I'm a patient man. He turned. Preston was already gathering the reins. And as the wagon pulled down the rutted drive and around the bend in the road, Nora heard the young man's voice carry back to her on the still morning air, easy and careless, the way a man speaks when he believes no one of consequence can hear him. Pop's right. She'll sell before Christmas. I'd bet $5 on it. Nora stood on her porch until the wagon was gone. Then she went inside, took Caleb's rifle down from above the fireplace, checked that it was loaded, and set it beside the front door where she could reach it quickly if Warren Holt or anyone sent by Warren Holt ever came onto her property again without invitation. Then she went back out and finished scrubbing Silas's boots. The sawmills. There were 3 within walking distance of the Marsh farm. If you define walking distance the way Crawford County, women of that era defined it, meaning any distance, your legs could carry you and still get you home before dark. Nora walked to each of them over the next 3 days, Silas beside her. Briar ranging ahead on the road with his nose working the ditch grass. She had put on her good dress, the dark wool one she had worn to Caleb's funeral, because she understood that how a woman presented herself in a business conversation in 1891 Arkansas was itself a form of argument. At the first mill, the owner told her he had no room for walnut. Not unfriendly about it, almost apologetic but firm. His yard was stacked with fallen oak from the storm, and he had orders backed up 3 months. He didn't say come back later. He said it the way a man says something when he means it permanently. At the second mill, the foreman was less polite. He looked at her from across a desk covered in invoices and said that she should go home and find herself a man who understood timber to handle the business for her. He did not say this cruelly. He said it as a piece of practical advice, the way you'd tell a child not to pick up a snake. It was the specific condescension of a man who had confused authority with knowledge his whole life and had never been corrected. Nora thanked him for his time and walked out. The third mill was Preston Holt's operation. Warren's son ran a smaller yard on the south end of Van Buren, cutting mostly hardwood for the furniture trade. Nora had known this before she walked in. She had walked in anyway because you do not learn the full shape of a problem by looking only at the parts that don't hurt. Preston was sitting on a barrel outside the mill office when she arrived. He recognized her immediately and made no effort to conceal his amusement. My father already told you the price, he said. $8. It hasn't changed. I'm not here to discuss your father's price, Nora said. I'm here to ask whether your mill has any interest in purchasing seasoned black walnut timber on terms to be discussed at a future date. Preston looked at her for a moment with genuine curiosity, the way a man looks at something he didn't expect to be interesting. Then the curiosity closed itself off and the smirk came back. Seasoned walnut. He said the words as though they were mildly entertaining. And when would this seasoned walnut be ready? When it's ready, Nora said. And if we wanted it before it's ready, you won't get it before it's ready. Preston studied her for another moment. Then he shook his head slowly. Mrs. Marsh, when you decide to be reasonable, and you will decide before the snow flies, my father's offer stands. We don't raise prices for desperate widows. We don't need to. Nora looked at him. She held the look long enough that he stopped smiling. Good day, Mr. Holt, she said. She walked home in silence. Silas asked her twice if she was all right. Twice she told him yes, though what she meant by yes at that moment was something more complicated, something closer to, I am still moving, I am still thinking, and as long as I am still thinking, there is still something to be done. Briar walked close at her heels the whole way back, not ranging ahead as he usually did. Dogs understand more than people give them credit for. He understood that this was not a day for ranging. The letter from Crawford County Savings was waiting on the porch when she returned. It had been left while she was gone. Someone had ridden out from Van Buren and tucked it under a stone on the railing. The envelope bore the bank's seal and the formal copperplate handwriting of Harlan Boggs, the bank's president, who had been president for 30 years, and conducted his correspondence with the austere precision of a man who believed that even bad news was improved by good penmanship. Nora opened it, standing on the porch with Silas leaning against her side and Briar sitting at her feet. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph reminded her that her property taxes, $35, were due by January 1st. The second paragraph reminded her that the outstanding loan taken by her late husband, Caleb, in the amount of $40 was due by March 1st, with accrued interest bringing the total to precisely $40.62, which the bank was prepared to round to $40 as a courtesy given her circumstances. $75 total, due in 2 installments. The second installment 5 months away. This was the official version of the letter. This was what Harlan Boggs had written. But the last sentence of the letter, the one she read 3 times before she understood its full meaning, was this: please be advised that several parties have expressed interest in acquiring the Marsh property should it become available through public auction. Several parties. She knew exactly which party. One party, wearing a hat, arriving in a matched roan wagon. Nora folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She felt the weight of it there, not the paper weight, which was nothing but the other weight, the weight of a deadline, of a clock that had started running the moment she opened that envelope. $75. She had 14. She fed Silas his supper. She sat with him on the porch while the light died out of the western sky, and she read to him from the book of Psalms, not because she was particularly devout, but because the Psalms were honest about difficulty in a way that most other texts were not. They did not pretend that hard things were anything other than hard. They just kept going anyway. She put Silas to bed. She kissed his forehead and told him that everything was going to be all right, because a mother's first obligation is to be the thing her child believes in, especially when she herself is not certain what to believe. Then she went back to the porch, to the rocking chair that Caleb had built for her the second summer of their marriage. From wood he'd milled himself, and she let herself feel the full weight of what was coming. Briar came and put his head in her lap. She stroked his ears in the long, slow way that always made his tail thump against the boards, but tonight his tail was still. He knew. "What do I do?" she asked him. She was not expecting an answer, but an answer came anyway, not from the dying, from something further back, from memories sharp and sudden and entirely unbidden, the way important memories always arrive, not when you go looking for them, but when you have finally stopped moving long enough for them to find you. Caleb had shown her the grove 3 years ago in the first summer of their marriage, on an evening in June when the light came horizontal through the trees and turned everything gold. He had walked her up the south-facing slope and told her about Ezra. Ezra Whitfield, Caleb's mother's father, the original owner of this land, the man whose name Caleb had given Nora as a kind of inheritance when they married, suggesting she hyphenate it with Marsh if she wanted, or leave it behind if she didn't, because he thought a woman's name was her own business. She had kept it. She was glad of it now in ways she hadn't anticipated. Ezra Whitfield had planted 42 black walnut seedlings on this slope in the spring of 1849 when he was 43 years old. He had selected the south-facing exposure deliberately. Walnut trees want full sun, want good drainage, want soil deep enough for the massive root systems they intend to develop. He had spaced them with a care that his neighbors found amusing because you do not space seedlings that carefully unless you intend to see them mature, and everyone in Crawford County in 1849 knew that black walnut trees took 40 years or more to reach their full value. Plant tobacco, they said. Plant corn. Plant something you can harvest before you die. Ezra had smiled at them and kept planting. He had died in 1867. He was 61 years old, and the oldest of his walnut trees was 18. They were tall by then, 35 feet, some of them, but they were nowhere near the size or the quality that made black walnut timber valuable. The really valuable wood. The wood that furniture makers in Louisville and Cincinnati and St. Louis were willing to pay serious money for came from trees at least 40 years old. At 40 years, the heartwood had darkened to that deep chocolate brown shot through with purple and black that was unlike any other wood on earth. At 40 years, the grain had tightened to the point where a skilled craftsman could produce a surface that held light the way still water holds light from within, not from without. Ezra had died 18 years short of that, but he had left a journal. Caleb had told her about the journal on that June evening, standing in the grove, his hand resting on the bark of the largest tree, the way you rest your hand on the shoulder of someone you want to speak seriously to. He wrote in it every year, Caleb said, about the trees, what he observed, what he expected. And there was one thing he wrote that I've never forgotten. He had closed his eyes the way he did when he was trying to retrieve something precisely. Then he recited it. The walnut tree gives 4 gifts. The husk gives color. The meat gives oil. The shell gives grit. The wood gives furniture. Never sell the whole tree when you can sell each part. She had not thought about that conversation in 2 years. She had not needed to. The trees had been standing. The trees had been fine. The trees had been the reliable future tense of her life, the thing that was definitely going to be there, the thing she didn't need to worry about because it was already taken care of. And now they were lying on the ground. 4 gifts. Nora stood from the rocking chair so suddenly that Briar startled backward, his nails scrambling on the porch boards, a single sharp yelp of surprise escaping him before he got his feet under him and stared at her with his ears forward and his head tilted, trying to understand what had just happened. She understood what had just happened. 4 gifts, she said aloud to the dog, to the night to the south-facing slope where 31 trees lay waiting. Not timber, not fallen wood, not $8, 4 gifts. Not a catastrophe, a transformation. She went inside to the chest in the bedroom, where Caleb kept his important papers, the deed to the land, his father's letters, the receipts from the lumberyard, the small, careful records of a careful man, and she searched through them until she found it. A leather-bound journal the size of a hymnal with the name Ezra Whitfield stamped in faded gold on the front cover. The leather had darkened with age until it was almost the same color as the walnut heartwood that Ezra had never lived to see. The brass clasp had gone green at the edges. She carried it to the porch. She lit the lantern and turned the wick up until the light was steady and full. Briar settled at her feet. The night was quiet in the way that only follows a great storm, emptied out, washed clean every small sound in it, more precise than usual. She opened the journal and began to read. The handwriting was small and cramped, the ink faded to the color of old tea in some places, but it was legible if you brought the lantern close and gave it your full attention. Nora gave it both. She read about the planting of the grove in the spring of 1849, Ezra's careful records of which seedlings went, where which survived and which failed, the slow attrition of those first few years as the weaker trees gave up and the stronger ones committed to the soil. She read about the neighbors who came by to shake their heads, about the years when it became clear that the surviving trees intended to be something significant. She read about the first harvest of walnuts, not the wood but the nuts themselves. The green husk split open in October, and the walnuts dropped, and Ezra discovered what every walnut farmer eventually discovers, that the husk of a black walnut is not waste. It is in its own right a product. Boiled in water 2 pounds of husk to 1 gallon and simmered 4 hours, the liquid turns the color of dark coffee and will dye wool or cotton or linen a brown so deep and so permanent that neither sunlight nor repeated washing will touch it. The tannins in the walnut act as their own fixative. No mordant required. A dyer who knows this needs no other brown. She read about the oil pressed from the walnut meat, clear and mild, burning in a lamp, without smoke or smell, a practical alternative to kerosene that grew on trees and cost only the labor of cracking and pressing. She read about the shells, crushed to a coarse grit, not sand harder than Carda's, softer than pumice walnut shell, is the finest natural abrasive for finishing furniture. Furniture makers who know it will not use anything else. It leaves a surface that the hand reads as silk. And then she read the passage she had been looking for, the one Caleb had recited from memory on that June evening in the grove. She found it written on a page near the middle of the journal, underlined once in a different ink, as though Ezra had come back to it later and wanted to make certain it would not be missed. The sawmills want the wood. Let them want. A walnut tree is worth more in pieces than it ever was whole. The fool sells his trees standing. The wise man sells his trees in parts. The husk brings color. The meat brings light. The shell brings finish. The wood, if dried 18 months until a thumbnail will not dent it, brings prices that green timber can never command. I will not live to see my trees mature, but the man who comes after me will find, if he has the patience to wait and the wisdom to understand what he is looking at, that I have left him something worth more than money. I have left him time. Nora closed the journal. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. The lantern burned lower. Briar breathed steadily at her feet, asleep, and his legs moving occasionally in whatever dog dream he was running through. On the south-facing slope behind the farmhouse, 31 black walnut trees lay in the dark, their husks already beginning to darken from green toward black, their heartwood full of color and oil, and a grit that furniture makers would pay real money for, and their wood if she could wait. If she could hold on long enough, if she could keep this farm out of Warren Holt's hands for 19 months worth more than anything Warren Holt had offered, more than anything he was capable of imagining, because he had only ever looked at those trees and seen timber. He had never looked at them and seen four gifts. In the morning she would begin. Nora did not go back to sleep that night. She sat on the porch with Ezra's journal in her lap until the sky behind the eastern ridge began to gray, and then she went inside and lit the stove and made coffee and thought with the methodical precision she had inherited from her own father, a man who had farmed marginal land in the Ozarks for 40 years and learned to think about money the way a chess player thinks about the board, always 2 moves ahead about what she actually had. She had 31 black walnut trees on the ground. She had Ezra's journal. She had a mind that worked. She had Silas, who was 7 and already steadier than most men twice his age. She had Briar, who was loyal beyond any reasonable expectation. She had 80 acres of Rocky Hill land that nobody in Crawford County wanted to buy at a fair price, which meant she could afford to keep it. She had $14. She had until January 1st. What she did not have yet was a buyer for walnut husk, a buyer for walnut oil, a buyer for walnut shell grit. And she could not think about the wood yet. The wood required waiting. The wood was the long game, the thing she would have to hold in her mind while she played the short one. First things first. The husks were already beginning to darken. She had seen this in the grove. The green outer shells of the walnuts that had fallen in the storm were already going black at the edges. Black walnut husks turned fast. You had days, not weeks, before they were fully black and beginning to soften and lose their potency. She needed to get them off the ground. She needed to collect them, weigh them, store them somewhere dry. And she needed to find who in Crawford County bought walnut dye, or who could use it if they understood what it was. She took out a piece of paper and wrote 3 names. Women who worked with fabric. Women who might know what walnut husk was worth. Then she went to wake her son. Silas took to the work the way children take to things that feel like purpose rather than obligation. He collected the smaller husks in a basket that Briar pulled on a little flat-bottomed cart Caleb had built for hauling firewood, repurposed now for something its maker had never imagined. Nora wore leather gloves on the first day. By the second day, the stain had worked through the leather and into the skin of her hands. By the third day, her hands were black from the knuckle to the wrist, and she understood with the clarity of something encountered rather than learned that this stain was permanent. She would carry this mark for the rest of her life. She did not see it as a curse. She would not allow herself to see it as a curse. She saw it the way a carpenter sees the calluses on his palms, or a farmer sees the permanent lean in his shoulders from decades of work as evidence, as proof. as the body's own record of what it had done. On the 12th of September, a woman appeared at the edge of the fallen grove. She was 58 years old, small and weathered with the particular economy of movement that belongs to women who have spent decades doing physical work and have learned not to waste emotion. Her name was May Calloway. She was a weaver. She had run a loom in the back room of her house outside Van Buren for 31 years, since her husband had died of a fever, and she had decided that grief was not a substitute for income. Her people were from County Cork, Ireland. She had been born in New York City in a tenement apartment 17 days after her parents arrived in America, and she had worked with her hands every day of her 58 years, and she knew what black walnut husk was worth because her grandmother had told her, and her grandmother's grandmother had told her grandmother, and that kind of knowledge does not die easily. She had heard about the fallen grove from her husband's cousin, who had heard it from the man at the feed store in Van Buren, who had heard it from Warren Holt himself. Holt had mentioned it while explaining to someone why he had declined to buy the timber, which was a version of the story that left out certain things Holt did not consider worth mentioning. But May Calloway had heard the word walnut, and she had heard something in that word that Warren Holt had not. She stopped at a respectful distance from where Nora was working and waited to be acknowledged. Briar growled. Nora quieted him with a touch. "I'm not here about the timber," May said. "I know you're not," Nora said, though she had not known this until May said it. "I want the husks." Nora straightened slowly. She looked at the woman standing at the edge of the fallen grove, looked at her eyes, which were fixed on the darkening husks scattered among the branches, with an intensity that Nora recognized because she had seen it in the mirror that morning. It was the look of someone who has found something valuable that everyone else has walked past. "What are they worth to you, Wano?" Nora asked. May Calloway's weathered face opened into the first real smile Nora had seen in 5 months. "More than the trees," she said. They made a deal that afternoon, sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the grove while Silas played nearby and Briar dozed in a patch of late summer sun. May would buy every husk Nora could collect at 2 cents per pound. This was 1/5 of what the Louisville dye suppliers charged for processed walnut dye. And it was still more money per pound than any sawmill in Crawford County would pay for the logs those husks were still attached to. But the deal was more than money, because May Calloway had something that could not be measured in cents or dollars. She had knowledge. In County Cork, May said, settling herself more comfortably on the log, her hands moving in her lap, the way the hands of people who work with fiber always move, even when there is nothing in them. "My grandmother dyed wool with walnut husk for 50 years. The color she produced in 1841 was the same color I can produce today, because walnut does not fade. It does not wash out. It does not compromise." She picked up a darkened husk and split it open with her thumbnail, revealing the hard shell beneath the inner shell that held the walnut meat. "The husk goes into water 2 pounds per gallon, simmer 4 hours until the water is the color of strong coffee. Strain it through cheesecloth and you have a dye bath that will color wool, cotton, linen, or leather, a deep warm brown with no mordant required. The tannins in the walnut are their own fixative. A bolt of fabric dyed with walnut husk will outlast the person who wears it." Nora listened with the attention she gave to the Psalms, the attention you give to something true. "My grandmother came from people who had almost nothing," May continued. "When the famine came and the landlords drove everyone off the land, she walked 40 miles to Cove with 5 children and boarded a ship. She died 3 days before it reached New York." The older woman paused. Her voice had dropped, but it had not wavered. "The last thing she told me, I was 12 years old holding her hand in the hold of that ship, was this: 'The world will try to take everything from you. Let it try, but never let it take your skills. A woman who can make something is a woman who cannot be destroyed.'" The silence that followed had weight to it. Then May looked at Nora's stained hands, black to the wrist, permanent, the mark of 3 days of work, and nodded once with an expression that contained no pity at all. "You've already started," she said. "Yes," Nora said. "Good." May stood brushing the bark dust from her skirt. "Then let's get to work." That evening, after Silas was in bed, Nora sat at the kitchen table with Ezra's journal open in front of her and a piece of paper beside it, and she did the arithmetic. 31 trees. Each tree had dropped its crop before it fell. The storm had shaken the walnuts loose as it pushed the trunks over. Thousands of walnuts lay scattered across the slope, buried in the fallen branches and the turned-up earth around the root balls. She estimated conservatively that she could collect 600 pounds of husk from the slope before the husks went past their useful point. 600 pounds at 2 cents per pound, $12. It was $4 more than Warren Holt had offered for the entire grove. She wrote this down. Then she wrote beneath it, oil from meat, shell grit, timber weight, 3 more gifts. 3 more lines of revenue from the same 31 trees. She could not see all of it, yet could not see the full shape of what she was building, but she could see the beginning. She could see enough to start. Outside, the night was quiet and the south-facing slope was dark. The trees lay where they had fallen. They were not going anywhere. They had time. And so she had decided, did she? September arrived in Crawford County the way it always did, not as a break from the heat, but as a slow negotiation with it, the mornings cooling first, then the evenings, while the afternoons held on to summer the way a man holds on to something he knows he is losing. Nora worked in the mornings when the air was coolest and her mind was sharpest. She worked through the afternoons when the heat pressed down on the slope like a hand. She worked into the evenings by lantern light, cracking walnuts on the limestone slab she had dragged up from the creek bed and positioned on the porch boards with the deliberateness of someone establishing a workstation they intend to occupy for a long time. Silas worked beside her. He was 7 years old and had his father's seriousness about things that mattered, and he had decided with the absolute moral clarity available only to children and very old men that this mattered. He could not swing the hammer with the precision the job required. The shell of a black walnut is so dense that a standard nutcracker will not open it, and the only reliable method is a sharp downward strike on the sawing line with a hammer angled 15 degrees from vertical, splitting the shell along its natural fault without crushing the meat inside. But he could collect. He could carry. He could pick the meat from cracked shells with fingers small enough to reach places Nora's couldn't. He could load the flat-bottom cart and drive Briar along the slope with the authority of a boy who has been given a real job and understands the difference between real work and make-believe. Every walnut on that slope was money. Not large money, not the kind of money that solved problems all at once, but the kind that accumulated. The kind that proved something. By the end of the first week of September, Aurora had collected 412 pounds of husk. By the end of the second week, she had reached 600. She weighed them on the farm scale in the barn and stacked the bushel baskets along the north wall away from the light in the order they had been filled. May Calloway came on the 14th of September with a wagon and a scale of her own and weighed every basket, and when the counting was done, she pressed $12.24 into Nora's stained hands, coins and not script, because May Calloway was the kind of woman who understood that coins are what you hold on to when the world gets uncertain. $12.24. $4 more than Warren Holt's offer for the entire grove. It's a start, May said. It is, Nora said. May stayed an extra 2 hours that afternoon. She helped Nora build the dye operation behind the barn, a fire pit ringed with creek stones 3 feet across, a tripod of iron rods above it, and May's own copper kettle lent indefinitely, which was her way of investing in a supply chain she intended to benefit from for years to come. This is not charity, May said, watching Nora position the kettle over the fire pit with the care of someone handling something borrowed and valuable. This is business. You produce the dye, I buy the dye, we both profit from the arrangement. She showed Nora the process precisely. 2 pounds of husk per gallon of water, brought to a simmer, not a boil because boiling drove off some of the tannins along with the steam. 4 hours of low heat, the liquid darkening steadily through amber and tobacco and coffee until it reached the deep, almost opaque brown that meant it was ready. Then through double-folded cheesecloth into jars sealed while still warm. The color is consistent, May said, holding a jar up to the afternoon light and turning it slowly. That's what my buyers care about most. They've been burned by inconsistent dye before bolts of fabric that came out uneven skeins that didn't match. If your dye is consistent, you'll have buyers who come back. How do I make it consistent? Same husk, same water, same time, same heat. Write it down, keep records. Don't guess. May set the jar down and looked at Nora with an expression that was equal parts instruction and appraisal. You're not making something casual here. You're making a product. There's a difference. Nora wrote it down. She had kept records since the first day, a small ledger book she had found in Caleb's desk, half empty, his handwriting on the first dozen pages giving way to her own. She wrote down every weight, every price, every buyer, every batch of day and its yield. She wrote down what worked and what didn't. She wrote down questions she didn't yet know the answers to and left space beneath them. The ledger was becoming, without her having planned it, as such a document of something being built. October arrived and the slope changed color. The walnut leaves turned yellow, not the brilliant yellow of maples, nothing showy, just a quiet, honest fading from green to gold to brown, practical and unpretentious, the tree's version of getting on with it. Nora had begun dyeing her own yarn. She bought undyed wool skeins from a supplier in Van Buren at 8 cents each, rough and pale the color of raw sheep, and ran them through the dye bath for 2 hours, turning them carefully with a wooden paddle to ensure even coverage, then rinsed them in cool water and hung them on the fence line to dry in the October air. The color that resulted was not simply brown. It was brown the way the inside of an old church is brown, layered and warm with undertones that shifted from amber to chocolate to something almost purple, depending on the angle of the light. It was the color of permanence, of things that had been made to last. She sold them at the Saturday market in Van Buren, 12 skeins on her first visit, laid out on a piece of burlap she had spread across the tail of a borrowed wagon. She priced them at 20 cents each, 12 cents above her cost, not counting labor, which she had decided at this stage not to count because labor was what she had in abundance and money was what she didn't. They sold in an hour and a half. She came back the following Saturday with 18 skeins. They sold in under an hour. The Saturday after that, a woman she had not seen before stopped at the wagon and picked up a skein and held it up and turned it in the light with the practiced eye of someone who works with color professionally. "Where does this come from?" the woman asked. "Black walnut," Nora said. "Local, from my property." The woman looked at her, then she looked at her hands. The stain had settled in completely by now. Permanent, precise, the color of the heartwood that lay drying on the slope behind her house. "How much are you charging per skein?" 20 cents. The woman bought 6. Then she asked if Nora did custom dyeing. If she brought fabric, would Nora dye it? Nora thought about this for approximately 3 seconds. 5 cents per skein, she said. 10 cents per yard of cloth. 3 weeks later, she had 3 regular customers bringing fabric to the farm for custom dyeing. She dyed wool and cotton and 1 bolt of linen that came out a color so close to the heartwood of the walnut logs lying on her hillside that she walked up to the slope afterward and held the fabric against the end grain of the largest trunk and marveled at the match. The same tree, the D and the wood. The color was the same because the source was the same. Opal Finch, who was Crawford County's most dedicated gossip and had held that position unchallenged for at least 2 decades, began calling Nora the witch woman sometime in October. The name spread the way these things spread in small communities too fast to track, arriving at dinner tables before anyone could remember who had first said it. The grounds for the accusation were from a certain angle understandable. A widow living alone on a remote farm with hands permanently stained black, boiling dark liquid in a kettle behind the barn, while her strange gray dog watched from a distance, Nora could see how it might look to someone who was not paying attention, like something from the wrong kind of story. She did not argue with it. She did not address it directly. She simply continued to set out her dyed skeins at the Saturday market and let the quality argue for itself, which it did more effectively than she could have. By November, the name had softened from witch woman to that walnut woman, which was neutral, and by December it was simply the Marsh widow, again, which was what she had always been, and which meant that the quality of her work had outweighed the story Opal Finch had tried to tell about her. The quality of the work always outweighs the story eventually. This is the thing that people who gossip never understand, that they are working in a perishable material, while the people they gossip about are working in something considerably more durable. The oil came next. Nora built the press in the last week of October, a screw press simple and functional. 2 boards of white oak held parallel by a threaded iron rod she bought at the hardware store in Van Buren for 65 cents. She pressed the walnut meat in bundles of cheesecloth, turning the screw slowly, watching the clear oil run from the bottom of the press into the jar she had positioned beneath it. The oil surprised her. She had expected something dark, something that carried the color of the walnut into it. But walnut oil is clear, or nearly clear, with the faintest gold tint like very pale honey. It burned in a lamp without smoke and without the particular kerosene smell that made winter evenings in closed rooms unpleasant. It was a better lamp oil than the oil she had been burning. It was cleaner. She knew that kerosene cost 12 cents a gallon from the store in Van Buren, which was the only place to buy it in the county. She priced her walnut oil at 20 cents a pint, the same price as kerosene by volume, and brought 4 pints to the Saturday market. A man named Hector Briggs, 67 years old, a farmer from the north part of the county, who had known Ezra Whitfield in passing and had watched the walnut grove grow for 40 years from a distance, stopped at her wagon and picked up a jar of the oil and held it up to the light. "Clear as spring water," he said. "Cleaner than kerosene," Nora said. "No smoke, no smell." He bought 2 pints on the spot, came back the following Saturday for 2 more, brought his neighbor. His neighbor brought his wife. The wife told someone at church. By the end of November, Nora was pressing 20 pounds of walnut meat per week and selling the oil as fast as she produced it. She was keeping careful records of yield: 4 pounds of meat to 1 pint of oil, consistent, reliable, the kind of ratio you could plan around. She added a column to her ledger. The shell grit came from Gideon Pruitt. He was 47 years old and ran a furniture shop in Van Buren that was, by the standards of Crawford County in 1891, exceptional. He made furniture that was designed to be used for 100 years, built with the joinery and the wood selection and the finishing work that such a commitment requires. He was not a famous man. He was not a wealthy man. He was simply a man who cared more about the quality of his work than about producing it quickly, which in any century is both a virtue and a commercial liability. Gideon Pruitt had been buying crushed walnut shell from a supplier in Cincinnati at 11 cents per pound. He used it as a finishing abrasive coarser than fine sandpaper, finer than anything that left scratches. On walnut and cherry and black oak, it produced a surface that felt to the hand like something between wood and silk, a finish that enhanced the grain rather than obscuring it. He came to the farm on a Thursday afternoon in early November, having heard about Nora's walnut operation from 3 separate sources in the course of a single week, which was enough for a man of his methodical temperament to take as a signal worth acting on. He was not a man who wasted words. He introduced himself at the gate, waited for Briar to determine that he was acceptable. The dog sniffed his hand and then sat down, which was as close to an endorsement as Briar offered anyone who wasn't Nora or Silas, and then said, "I understand you have walnut shells." "I do," Nora said, "ground to grit." "Not yet, but I can." He bought 20 pounds on the spot. Nora ground the shells that evening on a flat limestone slab with a river rock, a process that took 3 hours and left her forearms aching at 6 cents per pound. $1.20, less per pound than she was making on the husk. But the shells were a byproduct of the oil pressing material we had been setting aside without a plan for it. $1.20 for material she already had was $1.20 she hadn't expected. Gideon Pruitt looked at the pile of shells before she ground them, and then looked at the hillside, and then looked at her. "I've been working wood for 23 years, he said. "I've never met a woman who understood timber the way you do." "I don't understand timber," Nora said. "I understand patience." He considered this with the gravity of a man receiving information that changes his understanding of something. Then he looked at the pines on the hillside, 31 trunks lying on wooden cross pieces she had fashioned from branches elevated off the ground to allow air to circulate beneath them, their ends sealed with a mixture of beeswax and lard that she had prepared according to Ezra's journal instructions. "What are you doing with those?" he asked, waiting for them to be ready. "Ready for what?" "For someone who understands what they're going to become." Gideon Pruitt looked at the logs for a long moment. He walked to the nearest one and pressed his thumbnail into the end grain. It left a clear dent. The wood was still green, still full of moisture, still months away from what it would need to be. "When they're ready," he said, turning back to her, "come find me. I'll give you a price that will make Warren Holt choke on his $8. He bought 20 pounds of ground shell every month after that. Reliable, punctual paying in cash. November arrived, and with it the cold, and with the cold came the second letter from Crawford County Savings. Nora saw it on the porch when she came back from the slope. On a Tuesday afternoon, Silas had gone inside ahead of her, and Briar was nosing at the envelope with the wariness he reserved for anything that came from outside the property. She picked it up without hurrying. She had been expecting something. She had not known its exact shape, but she had felt it coming the way you feel, whether not from any single sign, but from the accumulation of small signs that a woman who has been paying attention learns to read. The letter was shorter than the first one. Harlan Boggs, in his copperplate handwriting, regretted to inform her that due to a reassessment of the bank's loan portfolio, the outstanding balance on the Marsh account, $40 previously due, March 1st would now be required by January 1st, alongside the property taxes of $35. Total due $75. All of it. By January 1st, 6 weeks away. She read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time, not because she had misunderstood it, but because she wanted to be certain she had understood it exactly right in all its implications. The reassessment of the bank's loan portfolio. She knew what that meant. She knew precisely what that meant and who had sat across a desk from Harlan Boggs and explained to him why a reassessment might be warranted in the specific case of the Marsh account. She had $42 saved from the husk and the oil and the shell grit. She needed 75. She had 6 weeks. It was November. The walnut season was winding down. The oil pressing was producing less as the meat supply dwindled, and the ground was beginning to freeze in the mornings, which made collecting anything from the slope harder. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the letter in front of her and the ledger open beside it, and she did the arithmetic again and again, rearranging the numbers the way you rearrange the pieces of a puzzle, hoping a different configuration will reveal something the first arrangement didn't. It kept coming out the same. She was $33 short with 6 weeks to find it. She got up, she stoked the fire, she started supper, and she let herself feel exactly as frightened as she was, not suppressing it, not performing calm, just feeling it clearly and completely, the way you feel something you intend to move through rather than around. Then she doubled her production. She cracked walnuts until her hands bled. She pressed oil in batches of 20 pounds instead of 10, working by lantern light after Silas had gone to bed, the kitchen warm from the fire, and the work briar asleep under the table with his chin on her foot. She took 3 more custom dyeing clients from the Van Buren market, charging up front rather than on delivery, because she needed the money now, not in 3 weeks. She wrote to May Calloway asking if May could take an advance order on the next season's husk. If she could commit now, Nora would guarantee the quality, and May wrote back in 2 days, yes, 50 pounds payment enclosed. She worked as though the farm would disappear beneath her if she stopped moving. And she worked because the alternative was to let Warren Holt win, and she had decided in the root cellar on the night of the storm, with her son's face in the dog's neck and the sound of 42 years of growing undone in 11 minutes, that she was not going to let Warren Holt win. She had not articulated it to herself exactly that way. She had not sat down and said, I am doing this because of Warren Holt. She had sat down and said, I am doing this because of Silas and because of Caleb and because of Ezra and because of the trees and because a woman who knows what she is building does not stop building simply because someone with a wagon and a matched pair of roans shows up to tell her she should. But underneath all of it, there was also this: Warren Holt had stood at the base of her porch steps and told her she would fail. And she had decided that he was wrong. May Calloway came on Thursday evenings throughout November and into December. She brought her cracking tools and sat beside Nora on the porch, 2 women working in the cold, with their breath making small clouds in the lantern light, the pile of shells growing beside their chairs, and the bowls of meat growing on the table between them. They talked while they worked. Do you ever think about remarrying? May asked one evening in the direct way she had, not prying exactly, but not willing to pretend that difficult subjects didn't exist. No, Nora said. The word came out simple and complete without apology or elaboration. Because of Caleb. Because I had one good man. I know what that is. I don't need to go looking for something I already had. May cracked 2 walnuts in quick succession, her technique clean and unhesitating. I had one bad man. The fever that killed him was the first time in 12 years that I was grateful for something he did. Nora looked at her. May's face was composed, not bitter, the face of someone who has long since finished processing a difficult truth and moved on to simply carrying it. I've avoided the species ever since, May said, though I'll admit that's easier some years than others. They laughed together in the dark, the sound rising and disappearing into the cold air above the silent hillside, and then they kept cracking. There was one evening in late November when May sat for a moment without working, her hands still in her lap, looking at the stars above the ridge. The cold had come in hard that week, and the walnut leaves were long gone, and the trees on the slope stood bare against the sky. My grandmother made it to the ship, May said. I've told you that, but I haven't told you what happened on the ship. Nora waited. There were 900 people in steerage. The crossing took 23 days. By the 12th day, my grandmother was burning with fever. By the 18th day, she couldn't stand. May's voice was steady, but it had the quality of something that had been steadied deliberately. She died on the 20th day, 3 days before we reached New York. My mother was 17 years old and had 5 younger siblings, and she stood at the rail of that ship and watched her own mother go into the Atlantic Ocean, and then she turned around and counted her brothers and sisters to make sure they were all still there. The night was very quiet. Briar had come to sit between them, pressed against Nora's knee. My mother used to say, May continued, that the thing her mother gave her, the thing that kept her going when everything else was gone, was not money and not land and not any object that could be carried or lost. It was knowledge. She knew how to make something. She knew how to take raw material and transform it into something that didn't exist before. And that knowledge couldn't be taken from her and couldn't be sunk in the Atlantic and couldn't be left on a dock in County Cork. She picked up a walnut and cracked it with a single precise blow. A woman who can make something is a woman who cannot be destroyed. Nora thought about this for the rest of that evening and for many evenings afterward. She thought about it when her hands ached and her back ached and the arithmetic in her ledger still came out $33 short. She thought about it at 2 in the morning when the cold had crept into the bedroom, and she lay awake listening to Silas breathe in the next room and wondering if she was going to be able to hold this together. She could make something. She was making something. Every batch of tea, every pint of oil, every pound of shell grit added to the pile in her ledger was evidence that she could take what appeared to be disaster and transform it into something that hadn't existed before. The knowledge was hers. No one could take it. Not Warren Holt, not Harlan Boggs, not the storm that had put her trees on the ground. She kept working. Agnes Marsh came to the farm on a cold morning in late November. She was Caleb's mother, 59 years old, with the upright bearing of a woman who had decided early that posture was a form of character and had never relaxed the decision. She and Nora had not been unkind to each other, but they had not been close. Agnes had disapproved quietly but consistently of Caleb's attachment to the farm. She had thought it was too remote, too demanding, too dependent on a grove of trees that would not reach their value in her son's lifetime. After Caleb's death, she had urged Nora twice to sell. Both times Nora had declined and the conversation had not continued. Agnes had not come back since. She came now in a wagon borrowed from her neighbor, driving herself the 6 miles from Van Buren, which at 59 in November was not a small thing. Briar went to the gate to meet her, assessed her with the thoroughness he applied to all arrivals, and then sat. He did not growl. Nora met her in the yard. Agnes looked at her for a moment, at her stained hands, her work dress, her steady eyes, and something in the older woman's expression shifted. She had come prepared for one thing and found another. The boy is well, she said. Silas is well, Nora said. He's on the slope. Come inside and warm up. Agnes came inside. She sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and looked around the room at the ledger open on the table, at the jars of Dane in oil lined up on the shelf, at Ezra's journal lying beside the ledger where Nora kept it, now available for reference used. Agnes reached out and touched the journal's cover. Just touched it with 2 fingers, as though she were putting her hand on something she recognized but had not expected to find. I remember this, she said quietly. Caleb's grandfather used to read from it. He talked about it the way other men talked about scripture. She turned it over in her hands gently. The 4 gifts. Yes, Nora said. Agnes set the journal down and looked at her daughter-in-law with an expression that contained, Nora thought, the first undefended thing she had shown her in 5 years of knowing each other. I told you to sell, Agnes said. You did. I was wrong. The directness of it was like the directness of May Calloway, surprising clean, the refusal to dress a hard thing in soft clothes. And it came because I have something for you, Agnes said. She reached into her coat and withdrew a small leather purse, an old, worn smooth at the edges, the kind of purse a woman carries for years. She set it on the table between them. $30. Everything I have saved. It's yours. Nora looked at the purse, then at Agnes. Call it a loan if your pride requires it, Agnes said with the first hint of sharpness that Nora recognized as the Agnes she knew. But know that I have no expectation of repayment. This is an investment in my grandson's future, and in the memory of my son who loved those trees because his grandfather told him to, and who was right to love them even if I didn't understand why. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two women who have been on opposite sides of something and have found without drama that they are no longer. Nora reached out and took the purse. "Thank you," she said. It was not a small thank you. It was the kind that carries weight. December moved through Crawford County with its usual combination of cold and quiet, the days shortening to their minimum, the nights long and still. Nora worked. She pressed the last of the walnut oil. She ground the last of the shell grit. She delivered two final batches of dyed fabric to customers in Van Buren who had ordered for Christmas gifts. And she stood at their doors in the cold and collected her money and said thank you, and drove home with Briar beside her on the wagon seat. She counted. $20 from the oil pressing, 16 from the custom dyeing, 7 from the shell grit, the $12.24 from May's husk purchase, 7 additional from the dye sales at the Saturday market, Agnes's 30, total $92.24 in the ledger, but she had spent 14 on supplies, the threaded rod for the press, the cheesecloth, the replacement for a section of barn roof that had finally given up oil and grain, and the things a farm requires to keep running. Remaining $78.24. She needed 75. She had $3.24 to spare. On the 31st of December, 1891, Nora Whitfield Marsh, dressed in the dark wool dress she had worn to Caleb's funeral, and to the Saturday markets, and to every formal occasion of the past 5 months, and she drove her wagon into Van Buren with Briar sitting beside her, and the cold coming off the ridge in long, slow waves. She walked into Crawford County Savings at 9 o'clock in the morning. Harlan Boggs was at his desk. He was a careful man, a fair man in the institutional sense, meaning he followed the rules he had been given, with consistency which sometimes looked like fairness and sometimes didn't, depending entirely on who had written the rules and whose interests they served. He looked up when she walked in, and his expression went through 3 distinct phases in perhaps 2 seconds: recognition, calculation, and something that might have been embarrassment quickly suppressed. Nora set $75 on his desk in cash coins, and bills counted twice that morning at the kitchen table before she left and said, "Taxes and the loan, paid in full." Harlan Boggs looked at the money. He looked at her hands. He looked at the money again. He picked up the bills and counted them with the methodical care of a man who does not allow himself to appear surprised, though he clearly was. "I must confess," he said, "that I did not expect this payment." "I know exactly what you expected, Mr. Boggs," Nora said. "I know exactly who told you to expect it, and I know exactly why." He said nothing. He was, after all, a careful man. She waited while he completed the receipt. She watched him write out the notation in his ledger. Marsh account balance clear January 1st, 1892, and stamp it with the bank's seal and hand her the paper. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "Good morning," she said. She turned and walked out of Crawford County Savings before he could find anything to say, and she climbed up onto the wagon seat, and Briar pressed against her side, and she sat for a moment in the cold morning air, looking up at the ridge to the south where 6 miles away, the south-facing slope behind her farmhouse held 31 walnut trees lying on wooden cross pieces, their ends sealed with beeswax and lard, their heartwood darkening slowly in the winter air, waiting 18 more months. She picked up the reins. The winter of 1891 into 1892 was long and cold and not always easy. There were nights when the wind came down from the ridge and found the gaps in the farmhouse walls, and Nora lay awake in the cold with the extra quilt pulled up and counted the things she had and the things she still needed to do. There were mornings when the ground was frozen solid and the water in the trough had to be broken with an axe, and the animals were unhappy, and Silas was tired, and the woodpile was lower than she wanted. There were evenings when she sat on the porch with Briar and talked to Caleb. Not out loud, not usually, but in the interior way that grief eventually teaches you, the ongoing conversation with someone who cannot answer but who is still somehow present in the quality of the silence. She told him about the dye and the oil and the grit. She told him about May Calloway and Gideon Pruitt and the $12.24. She told him about Agnes showing up with $30 in a worn leather purse and saying I was wrong with the directness of someone who understood that dignity comes from telling the truth, not from protecting yourself from it. She told him about the bank. "I think you would have laughed," she told him on one of those evenings. Not unkindly, but you would have laughed. The spring came. The walnut trees leafed out again from the stumps. Walnut trees are vigorous resprouters, and the root systems of 31 mature trees were still alive beneath the ground, still drawing water and nutrients, already sending up new growth along the trunks of the fallen wood. Nora let the sprouts grow. She would manage them later, deciding which to keep and which to clear. For now, they were evidence of something she found useful to think about. That what looks like destruction from above is sometimes from below, just a change in direction. She checked the logs weekly through the spring and into the summer of 1892. She pressed her thumbnail into the end grain Ezra's test, precise and simple, and recorded what she found in the ledger. Still green, still denting, still months away. She collected the second season's walnut crop and ran it through the dye operation with the efficiency she had developed the previous fall. May bought every pound of husk. The oil press ran through October and into November. Gideon Pruitt came monthly for his shell grit, always on time or always cash. By the end of 1892, the ledger showed that Nora had paid her taxes on time, had put aside enough for the following year's taxes, and had a small surplus, not large. Not the kind of surplus that changes your life, but the kind that means you are no longer managing from crisis to crisis. The kind that means you have crossed without ceremony from surviving to building. Warren Holt did not come back. His son Preston did not come back. She heard from May that Warren had acquired several other storm-damaged properties in the county at favorable prices. Other widows, other farms, other owners who had concluded that the offer on the table was better than what they could achieve alone. She heard this without satisfaction and without contempt. She understood Warren Holt better than she had in August of 1891. He was not a villain in the operatic sense. He was a man who had looked at the world and concluded that speed was more valuable than patience, that a bird in the hand was always worth more than two in the bush, that a widow with stained hands in a fallen grove was an asset waiting to be acquired rather than a person in the process of building something. He was wrong, but his wrongness was of the common variety, the failure of imagination that afflicts most people most of the time. It was not cruelty. It was the simple human inability to see what a thing might become when you can see so clearly what it is. Through 1892 and into 1893, Nora checked the logs. The thumbnail test was becoming different. Less compliance, more resistance. The wood was giving back less of itself with each passing month, hardening from the inside out as the moisture left and the fibers tightened and the grain settled into the final configuration it intended to keep for the next century. She had been waiting for this. She had been building toward this moment for 19 months. Every batch of dye, every pint of oil, every pound of shell grit had been in addition to income, a way of holding on, a way of buying time, a way of keeping the farm while the real value of the grove accumulated quietly on the hillside, unmeasured by anyone except the woman who walked up the slope each week with her thumbnail and her ledger and her patience. In the first week of March 1893, 19 months and 11 days after the storm, Nora walked up the south-facing slope in the early morning before Silas was awake with Briar moving through the new grass ahead of her. She went to the largest of the fallen trunks, the one that had been in the grove's standing days the oldest and most massive, and she crouched beside it and pressed her thumbnail into the end grain with the full force of her hand behind it. The wood did not dent. She pressed harder. Still nothing. The surface accepted the pressure and gave back nothing. No mark, no impression, nothing that would tell a thumbnail-sized story of moisture still trapped inside. She stood up. She looked at the log. Then she looked at all 31 of them lying in their parallel rows on the cross pieces, their bark beginning to peel away in long strips to reveal the dark heartwood beneath that deep chocolate brown shot through with veins of purple and black that was unlike any wood on earth and that no kiln, no matter how carefully managed, could fully replicate. She reached into her coat pocket and took out a pencil and her ledger. She wrote March 7th, 1893. Thumbnail test no dent, wood ready. She looked at the entry for a moment. Then she walked down the slope and into the farmhouse and wrote a short letter to Gideon Pruitt, which she gave to Silas to carry to the Van Buren post office on his way to school. The letter said, "The wood is ready. Come when you can." Gideon Pruitt came the next morning. He rode up the rutted drive on a gray mare just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the light coming in low and slanted the way. March light comes in Arkansas, thin and honest, without the warmth it promises. He had Nora's letter in his coat pocket, though he had read it only once. He did not need to read it twice. He had been waiting for it since November of 1891, when he had stood on this slope and pressed his thumbnail into green wood and told a widow with stained hands that when it was ready, he would give her a price that would make Warren Holt choke. He dismounted at the fence and tied the mare to the post. Breyer came to assess him, the same ritual, the same sniff, the same seated verdict of acceptable. Nora met him at the gate. Silas stood behind her, 8 years old now, taller than he had been in August of 1891, with the watchful composure of a child who has spent 19 months watching his mother build something from what everyone else had written off as wreckage. Gideon nodded to Nora. He nodded to the boy. Then he looked at the slope, and he went to work. He walked the length of the grove methodically, the way a craftsman moves through a lumberyard, not browsing but reading. He ran his hands along the bark of each trunk, finding the places where it had begun to pull away from the wood, beneath which is what bark does when the wood has finished its long process of becoming. He pressed his thumbnail into end grain log after log, moving down the line with the deliberateness of someone conducting an examination that matters. He said nothing for a long time. Nora did not fill the silence. She had learned in 19 months of this work that silence is sometimes the most productive thing available to you. Gideon stopped at the third log from the east end. He crouched beside it and put his face close to the end grain and breathed in a long, slow breath, the kind a man takes when he is trying to read something with a sense other than sight. "Do you smell that?" he asked. "Yes," Nora said. It was the smell of seasoned walnut, something between wood and earth, and something older than either, a smell that furniture makers spend their whole careers chasing, and that cannot be manufactured or accelerated. It comes from the wood when the wood is ready and not before. Gideon stood. He moved to the next log and did the same, hands, thumbnail, nose. Then the next. Then he walked to the far end of the line and came back along the other side, checking, confirming, building, in his craftsman's mind, the precise picture of what he was dealing with. When he had finished, he stood at the center of the grove and looked at Nora. 19 months, he said, 19 months and 11 days. She said, most sawmills would have cut these green. He said it not as criticism of other mills, but as a statement of fact, the kind of fact that has weight because it describes not what should happen, but what actually does. They would have cut them green and called it good enough and produced lumber that warped and split and gave their customers furniture that moved with the seasons in ways furniture is not supposed to move. They would have rushed because rushing is what you do when you think speed is the same as efficiency. He looked down the line of logs one more time. You gave them time, he said. You gave them patience. And because you did, he stopped. He shook his head slowly with the expression of a man who has encountered something in his professional life that he did not expect to encounter. This is the best black walnut I have seen in 23 years of working wood. The grain is tight, the color is correct, the moisture is gone, and what's left is exactly what was always meant to be here if someone had the sense to wait for it. Nora said nothing. She let it land. $60, Gideon said, for 10 logs, and from 3 more I will build you a table, a bed frame, and a rocking chair. The table will seat 8, the bed frame for your son, the rocking chair for you. I won't charge you labor. The wood is payment enough for what I'll learn from working it. $60 for 10 logs. Warren Holt had offered $8 for all 31. She did not do the arithmetic out loud. She did not need to. And when they're finished, she said, I want something carved. Name it. On the inside of the bed frame, the headboard inside where you'd only see it if you looked for it. She paused. Ezra Whitfield's words. The walnut tree gives 4 gifts. Never sell the whole tree when you can sell each part. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Then he took his notebook from his coat pocket and wrote it down carefully, making certain he had every word. It'll be there, he said. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was the grip of a man who works with his hands strong, dry, brief. The kind of handshake that means the deal is made and there is nothing left to discuss. Then came the sound of a wagon on the road. Warren Holt's matched roans came around the bend in the drive before either of them had moved. The wagon was the same one, the same good quality rig, the same deliberate presentation of prosperity, but Warren was alone this time. No Preston, no measuring tape coiled in the vest pocket, no patient, sympathetic smile assembled for the occasion. He looked different. He looked like a man who had spent some portion of the previous 19 months reconsidering a calculation he had been certain about and had discovered in the recalculating that he had made an error. He stepped down from the wagon without his usual deliberateness. The careful management of his weight that had always announced his confidence was absent. He walked to the edge of the fallen grove and looked at the logs, and something crossed his face when he looked at them, something specific and undefended that Nora had not seen on Warren Holt's face before. It was the look of a man who understands what he is looking at and wishes he had understood it 19 months earlier. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "Mark Holt." His eyes went to Gideon Pruitt, standing beside her notebook still in hand. The two men knew each other in a county this size. Everyone in the timber and furniture business knew each other. Something passed between them that Nora read clearly. Warren understanding what Gideon's presence meant and what had already been agreed to. "I'll give you $50, Warren said, "for the timber. All of it." He said it without the packaging he had brought to his first visit. No sympathy, no elaborate explanation, no suggestion that he was doing her a favor. Just the number offered like a card turned face up on a table. It was more than 6 times his original offer. It was 58% of what Gideon had just offered for 10 logs. Gideon said nothing. He stood with his arms crossed and a small composed expression on his face. Not a smirk. Nothing like Preston's smirk, but the expression of a man who has watched a negotiation develop and can see precisely how it ends. Nora looked at Warren Holt for a long moment. "You told me the offer would not improve with age," she said. "You said it would stay at $8. You told me I would come back to you before Christmas." She kept her voice even. Not cold, not warm. Simply level the voice of someone stating facts that have been verified. "You went to Harlan Boggs at the bank and told him to move my deadline. You tried to force me to sell before the wood was ready." Warren's jaw tightened. He did not deny it. He was at the core of him a man who did not lie even when the truth was inconvenient. It was the best thing about him, and in this moment it was costing him considerably. "You said I would fail," Nora continued. "Your son bet $5 on it. I know what I said. I know that you know." She paused, letting the weight of it settle. "I did not fail. I did not sell. I did not come crawling back before Christmas. And now you are standing in my grove offering me $50 for timber that I have just agreed to sell for $60, and you are standing there in front of the man I just shook hands with." Warren looked at Gideon. Gideon met his eyes without expression. Warren looked back at Nora. "The offer stands," he said. "One more time. The last card." "Mr. Holt," Nora said, "get off my land." She said it the same way she had said it 19 months ago, not shouted, not performed, simply said with the complete certainty of a person standing on ground that is entirely their own. Warren Holt held her gaze for a moment. He was a man of considerable pride, and pride, when it meets something it cannot move, takes time to reorganize itself. It took perhaps 5 seconds. Then he turned, walked back to his wagon, gathered his reins, and drove away down the rutted drive without looking back. The sound of the wheels diminished around the bend and was gone. Gideon Pruitt looked at Nora. "He'll remember that," he said. "I expect he will," Nora said. "So will I." She turned back to the logs and the work that remained. Gideon milled the wood at his shop in Van Buren, cutting it on a bandsaw he had purchased secondhand from a mill in Memphis. A good machine, precise, capable of the kind of thin curve cutting that wastes the least of what you put into it. He cut the 10 logs into boards of varying thickness, sorting them by grain and figure as they came off the saw, stacking them in his drying room in the order he intended to use them. The lumber that came out of those logs was, as he had said on the slope, unlike anything he had worked in 23 years. The grain was tight, the rings close together, evidence of slow growth in good soil over many decades, and the color was the deep chocolate brown of mature black walnut, consistent through the boards, not the pale sapwood that dominates younger timber. The figure was extraordinary in several boards. The grain ran in long, gentle waves that caught the light differently at different angles, the wood appearing almost to move when you shifted your position relative to it. He built the table first. 8-seat stretcher-based breadboard ends on the top to allow for seasonal movement, drawboard mortise and tenon joints that would hold for a century without glue. He surfaced the top with the walnut shell grit he bought from Nora. The irony of using the byproduct of her own trees to finish her own table was not lost on either of them, and the result was a surface that seemed to contain the light rather than reflect it, warm and deep, as though the wood were generating something from within. Nora drove out to Van Buren to see it when it was done. She stood beside it in Gideon's workshop and put her hand flat on the top and was quiet for a moment. "Caleb would have loved this," she said. "I know," Gideon said, though he had only met Caleb twice. He knew because the table was made from Caleb's grandfather's trees and something of that lineage had come through in the wood itself. The bed frame came next, solid walnut, simple in its lines, with the headboard as the central statement. Gideon spent 3 evenings on the headboard alone. The carving of the walnut leaves pattern that framed the inscription was detail work that rewarded slowness. And he was a man who understood that the work you do when no one is watching is the work that determines what kind of craftsman you are. On the inside face of the headboard, in letters an inch tall, cleanly cut, he carved, "The walnut tree gives 4 gifts. Never sell the whole tree when you can sell each part." Beneath it in smaller letters, Ezra Whitfield, 1849. When the frame was delivered to the farm and assembled in Silas's room, replacing the pine bed that had been there since before Nora could remember, Silas climbed into it and looked at the headboard and ran his fingers along the carved letters, slowly reading each one. "This is from the trees, isn't it?" he said. It was not quite a question. "From great-grandfather Ezra's trees," Nora said. "He planted them in 1849 before your grandfather was born. Before your father was born. Before I was born." She sat on the edge of the bed beside him. "He planted them for you, Silas. He just didn't know your name yet." Silas looked at the inscription for a long time. He was 8 years old and would turn 9 in the spring, and he was at the age where a child begins to understand that the world existed before he arrived in it and will continue after he leaves, which is one of the more disorienting realizations available to a human being. "Did he know someone would find the journal?" Silas asked. "I think he hoped someone would." "Did he know someone would wait long enough?" Nora thought about this. "No," she said. "I don't think he knew, but he trusted that someone would. There's a difference between knowing and trusting." Silas considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then he lay back on the walnut frame and looked at the ceiling. "I like it," he said. The rocking chair took Gideon longest. 2 weeks, he told Nora, when he delivered it, longer than the table and the bed frame combined. He was unapologetic about this. "A rocking chair isn't furniture," he said, setting it on the porch in the place where Caleb's old pine rocker had stood for 3 years. "A rocking chair is a conversation between a body and a piece of wood. Getting that conversation right takes time." Nora sat in it. She put her hands on the arms and felt the way the walnut had been shaped to receive them. Not carved to a template, but worked until the fit was right, the wood responding to the hand rather than demanding the hand respond to it. She rocked once, twice, feeling the arc of it, the way the weight distributed through the joints, and came back to her as motion. "Sit in it," she told Gideon. He sat. He rocked. He nodded slowly with the satisfaction of a craftsman who has solved a problem correctly and knows it. May Calloway came that evening and sat in the chair herself, running her hand along the arm, with the attention she gave to any textile or material that claimed to be high quality. "The color matches the dye," she said. "The same brown, the same depth." "It should," Nora said. "The dye in the wood came from the same tree." May rocked in silence for a moment, looking out at the south-facing slope, where the remaining logs lay on their cross pieces, the evening light falling across them at an angle that showed the heartwood's color even from this distance. "What are you going to do with the rest?" she asked. "Wait," Nora said. "You're very good at that." "I've been practicing." The news traveled through Crawford County the way significant news travels in small communities, not in headlines or announcements, but in conversations one person to the next, each retelling, adding a small embellishment that the next person subtracted, until what remained was the essential fact stripped of ornament: $60. Gideon Pruitt, the Marsh Widow, the Walnut Grove, the trees everyone had said were worthless. Judge Elias Harlan heard it at the courthouse. He was 61 years old, a tall man with the angular face and the careful eyes of someone who has spent 3 decades listening to people tell him what they want him to believe and has become proficient at distinguishing that from what is actually true. He had watched the situation on the Marsh farm from a distance since the storm, not with indifference, but with the specific caution of a man in his position who has learned that inserting himself into a private matter before he understands it fully is rarely helpful. He understood it now. The $60 told him what he needed to know. Not just that Nora Marsh had prevailed, but that she had prevailed through a method, through a specific demonstrable application of knowledge and patience that produced a result measurably superior to what the alternative would have produced. He came to the farm on a Tuesday morning in April, unannounced, driving himself in a modest buggy that was notably less impressive than Warren Holt's matched roans. He was not a man who used transportation to make arguments about himself. Nora was at the dye kettle when he arrived. She was running the first batch of the new season's husk, and her hands were black to the wrist, and she did not apologize for this or offer to clean up before speaking to him. She simply turned from the kettle and said, "Judge Harlan, what can I do for you?" He looked at the operation behind the barn, the fire pit, the kettle, the jars lined up on the shelf inside the barn door, the press for the oil, the grinding stone for the shell. He looked at it the way he looked at evidence, trying to understand what it told him about the person who had assembled it and the decisions they had made. "I owe you an apology," he said. Nora waited. "I watched what was happening here from August of 1891, he said. "I knew Warren Holt. I knew what he was doing at the bank. I could have spoken to Harlan Boggs. I chose not to because I told myself it wasn't my business." He held her gaze steadily. "I was wrong. A man in my position who says something isn't his business, when he watches a widow being squeezed, that man has confused his authority with his conscience." The directness of it was remarkable. Nora had heard a great many things from a great many people in the past 19 months, and very few of them had sounded like that. "What changed your mind?" she asked. "The $60, he said. "Because of the amount. Because of what it represents. Because it tells me that a woman on this farm in Crawford County, Arkansas, understood something about value and patience that the most experienced timberman in this county did not understand. And she proved it by doing the work and waiting as long as the work required." He paused. "I would like to commission a table." Nora looked at him. "A table. For my courtroom, a proper table, not the institutional pine that's been in there since 1874. Walnut, from these logs when they're ready." He said it the way he said things in court, not as a request to him, but as a statement of what he intended that left room for the other party to respond. "The logs won't be ready for some time yet," Nora said. "I'll need to be selective, the best wood from the remaining logs." "I understand patience," he said. "I've been a judge for 30 years. It's most of what the job requires." She almost smiled. "I'll let you know when they're ready." He nodded. He looked at her hands again, the permanent stain, the evidence, and something in his expression acknowledged what it represented. Then he got back in his buggy and drove toward Van Buren. And 2 days later, Nora heard that he had stood in his own courtroom and told the assembled attorneys and county officials that he had seen work of a quality on the Marsh farm that put most commercial timber operations in the county to shame, and that he intended to put walnut from that grove in his courtroom, and that anyone who had doubted Nora Marsh's judgment was welcome to form a revised opinion. In a county this size, a judge saying that in a courtroom is roughly equivalent to a newspaper printing it. By the following Saturday, 3 new customers had found their way to the farm to inquire about dyed fabric and custom walnut products. Opal Finch, who had called her the witch woman and whose gossip had followed Nora through the fall and winter of 1891, came to the Saturday market in Van Buren in early May and bought 4 skeins of walnut-dyed yarn at full price. She did not apologize. She was not a woman who apologized. But she paid without bargaining, which for Opal Finch represented a form of reckoning with the evidence. In the spring of 1894, a man named Everett Marshall came to Crawford County from Louisville. He was 51 years old, a buyer for one of the larger furniture importers in Kentucky, a man who had spent 28 years traveling through the hardwood regions of the American South and Midwest in search of exceptional material. He had an eye for wood, the way certain people have an ear for music, not as information, but as experience, something encountered rather than assessed. He had seen Gideon Pruitt's walnut pieces at a trade exposition in Lexington the previous autumn, had put his hands on the table surface, and stood without moving for 30 seconds, and had then asked Gideon with the directness of a man who does not waste time, "Where does this wood come from?" It had taken him 3 conversations and 2 letters to trace the chain from Gideon back to the farm in Crawford County, Arkansas. He arrived in a hired buggy dressed in the clothes of a city man who has learned to travel comfortably with the experienced eyes of someone who has been disappointed before by stories that outran their subjects. He was not disappointed. Nora walked him up the south-facing slope herself. She let him look. She did not narrate. She had learned in the course of the previous 2.5 years that the wood spoke most clearly when no one was talking over it. Everett Marshall moved through the remaining logs the way Gideon Pruitt had moved through them the year before, with hands and thumbnail and nose building his assessment from direct contact rather than description. He was more methodical than Gideon, which made sense. He was buying, not making, and the distinction shapes how a man looks at material. He pressed his thumbnail into the end grain of 5 logs before he stopped. Each time nothing. No dent, no compliance, just the solid, quiet refusal of wood that is finished becoming and knows what it is. He stood at the center of the slope and looked down the line of logs and said a word Nora had heard from Gideon, but had not expected to hear again so soon. Cathedral grade, he said, quietly as though he were in fact in a cathedral and the acoustics required it. Mrs. Marsh, do you understand what that means? Tell me, she said. It means this wood is suitable for the finest furniture built in the world today. It means the grain is tight enough, the color is deep enough, and the seasoning is thorough enough that a master craftsman in Louisville or Cincinnati or New York or London could work this wood and produce something that will outlast every person in this county by 3 centuries. He turned to face her. There are walnut pews in churches in England that have been there since the 1600s. That's what cathedral grade means. It means the wood was worthy of what they put it to. He looked at the logs again. I will give you $140, he said, for 12 logs of my choosing. $140, more than the entire grove had been assessed at standing before the storm. More than the farm and the barn and the land combined, as Warren Holt had valued them when he offered $200 for everything. More than Nora had earned in any single year from the farm mom in the entirety of her time on it. She said, which 12? He pointed. She looked at his choices and understood them. He had selected the logs with the most consistent grain, the darkest heartwood, the ones that had fallen on the most sheltered part of the slope and had dried most evenly. He knew what he was doing. He had spent 28 years learning to know it. All right, she said. They shook hands. His grip was the grip of someone from the city who negotiates daily firm, but not prolonged professional. He paid half in advance cash-folded bills that Nora put in the inside pocket of her coat and carried home with the specific care you give to something that represents the vindication of a very long bet. The news of $140 moved through Crawford County considerably faster than the news of $60 had moved, because $140 in 1894 in Crawford County, Arkansas, was a number that required a moment to process before you could repeat it. It arrived at the courthouse, at the feed store, at the Methodist church, at the Saturday market in Van Buren, at every dinner table in the county before the week was out. It arrived at Warren Holt's mill. Preston Holt had lost his $5 bet in the winter of 1891. He had paid it without making a scene about it because he had the intelligence to understand that making a scene about it would not improve his position. But the loss had sat with him in the way that small humiliations sit with young men who are certain of their own judgment, not forgotten exactly, but filed away, accruing interest of a kind that has nothing to do with money. When the $140 reached him, he avoided eye contact with Nora Marsh at every subsequent encounter in Van Buren. Obviously not in a way that announced itself, but she noticed because she was a woman who had learned to read the room in the way that people learn things they were not taught, through necessity, through attention, through the accumulated experience of watching how people behave when they think no one of consequence is watching. His avoidance was its own kind of acknowledgement. She did not need anything more from him. The autumn of 1895 arrived with its usual negotiation between summer and winter, the mornings cooling first, the afternoons holding on. Nora was on the porch in the walnut rocking chair, Gideon's chair curved to receive her, moving under her, with the ease of something that has found its right relationship to its purpose when the figure appeared on the road. She recognized him before he reached the gate. The walk, the weight, the particular way he held his hat when he was not wearing it. She had studied Warren Holt enough in the summer of 1891 to know him by his gait at 100 yards. He was alone. No Preston, no wagon. He had come on foot, which she had not expected, and which told her more than any arrival by wagon could have told her. Briar rose from the porch boards where he had been sleeping. The low, continuous sound that Briar had produced in Warren Holt's presence since August of 1891 began again. Nora let it continue. She did not put her hand on the dog's neck. She let him say what he had to say. Warren stopped at the base of the porch steps. He held his hat in both hands in front of him, turning it slowly by the brim, and he looked up at her with the eyes of a man who has spent 4 years reconsidering something and has arrived at a conclusion that cost him considerably. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. "Mr. Holt." Briar's sound continued low and steady. "I need to buy your remaining logs," Warren said. Nora rocked once. The chair moved under her, even and unhurried. "Why?" she asked. "My customers want air-dried walnut." He said it flatly without the packaging of his first visit. "They have seen what Gideon Pruitt has built from your wood. They have seen what Everett Marshall has brought back to Louisville from your wood. They want that quality, and I cannot provide it because I cut timber green and kiln dry it fast, and the result is—" He stopped. The pause lasted long enough to be its own statement. "The result is not cathedral grade." Nora looked at him. She looked at the hat going around in his hands slowly, and she understood that this was the physical expression of something that had no other place to go. Warren Holt was a man who did things with his hands when his mind was working through something difficult. "I'll pay $15 per log," he said, "for the 6 you have left. $90 for all of them. $90 for 6 logs. 110 times his original price per log. He had offered $8 for 31 trees, roughly 26 cents per log. He was now offering $15 per log for the privilege of buying the ones that remained. "Those logs are not for sale," Nora said. Warren blinked. He had expected negotiation. He had come prepared for negotiation. "Mrs. Marsh, those logs belong to my son," she said. "When Silas is old enough to decide what to do with them, he will make that decision. Until that day, they stay on this land where his great-grandfather planted them, and his father loved them, and his mother saved them. They are not for sale at any price, Mr. Holt." Warren stood at the bottom of the porch steps with his hat in his hands and said nothing for a long moment. Briar's sound had reduced to something barely audible. "You were right," Warren said finally, "and I was wrong, about the timber, about the price, about what you were capable of doing alone." He held her gaze, and the thing she saw in his face was not the patience or the sympathy or the calculation of 1891. It was something simpler and harder. "I went to Harlan Boggs. I told him to move your deadline. I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I told myself I was doing what made sense, business sense. But what I was doing was trying to force your hand before you could prove me wrong." The silence between them had weight, the kind of silence that follows a true thing said out loud for the first time. "You were not wrong about me, Mr. Holt," Nora said. "You were wrong about the value of patience, and that is not the same thing at all." Warren looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, a single deliberate movement like the closing of a ledger. He turned and walked back down the drive. She watched until he rounded the bend in the road and was gone. Briar came and put his chin on her knee. She stroked his ears. His tail moved once slow and final against the porch boards. By the autumn of 1896, 5 years after the storm, Nora Whitfield Marsh had earned $415 from 31 fallen black walnut trees. She had not planned this precisely. She had not sat down in September of 1891 and drawn up a projection and arrived at this number by working backwards from it. She had followed Ezra's journal and her own intelligence, and the knowledge that May Calloway had brought to her on a September afternoon when Briar had growled and the slope had been covered with darkening husks, and everything had looked to anyone not paying the right kind of attention like total loss. $415. Here is what it came from. Walnut husk dye sales and wholesale to May Calloway over 5 seasons, $50. The oil pressed from the walnut meat over 2 full seasons, $35. The crushed shell grit sold to Gideon Pruitt and 3 other woodworkers in the county over 4 years, $45. The timber 10 logs to Gideon Pruitt, 12 logs to Everett Marshall, 3 logs rendered as furniture in lieu of cash, and smaller sales to Judge Harlan's court table, and 2 private commissions that Gideon referred her way, $285. 4 gifts, 4 lines. $415 from 31 trees that had been on the ground. She wrote the final total in the ledger and looked at it for a long time. $415. The county assessor had valued the standing grove at 400 before the storm. The storm had not reduced that value. It had changed its form, required her to find it through 4 doors, instead of one, demanded that she wait and work and refuse and wait some more. She had done those things. And here was the number. She kept the 6 remaining logs on the hillside. They sat through the winters and the summers and the slow turning of the seasons, drying further, hardening, gradually darkening year by year until the chocolate brown of their heartwood approached something close to black in the right light, and the veins of purple running through the grain looked like lightning captured in wood. In 1897, she planted trees. 12 black walnut seedlings selected from the sprouts that had come up from the old root systems since the storm, transplanted to new positions on the slope with the care and the spacing that Ezra's journal prescribed. She had read those pages so many times by now that she could have written them from memory. Silas helped her plant them. He was 13 years old and tall for his age, doing the work with the ease of a boy who has grown up working, who does not distinguish between ordinary days and remarkable ones, because he has understood from watching his mother that the remarkable is made from the accumulation of ordinary. When the last seedling was in the ground and the soil firmed around its roots, Silas stood up and looked at the slope and then looked at her. "You won't live to see these trees mature," he said. It was not cruel. He was 13 and literal, and it was simply true. Nora looked at her son. She saw Caleb in the set of his jaw. She saw Ezra, whom she had never met, in the patience behind his eyes. She saw further ahead than she could clearly make out the children he would have, and the children those children would have, and the long line of people who would stand on this slope in the decades and centuries after her and find something here that she had chosen to put here. "No," she said, "I won't." She looked at the seedlings, 12 small trees, thin as her wrist, barely taller than Silas, waving slightly in the March wind. Ezra Whitfield planted 42 trees in 1849 and died in 1867 and never saw a single one of them reach maturity, she said. "But your father harvested those trees, and your children will harvest the trees I plant today, and their children will harvest the trees your children plant." She looked at Silas. "That is what a legacy is, not what you take from the world, what you leave in it." Silas looked at the seedlings for a long time. He was 13, which is an age where the long view is not yet natural, where the distance between planting and harvesting is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. But he was his father's son and his mother's son and his great-great-grandfather's descendant, and something in him recognized the principle, even if the full weight of it would take decades to settle. "All right," he said. They walked back down the slope together, Briar ranging ahead, as he always did on good days, his gray-brown coat bright against the new spring grass. Briar died on a morning in April, 1899. He was old by then, 11 years old, gray around the muzzle, and stiff in the mornings, slower to rise from his spot by the kitchen fire. He had been slowing for months in the way that old dogs slow, with the gradual, undramatic dignity of a creature that understands its own condition and makes no complaint about it. He died on the porch with his head in Nora's lap and the morning sun coming across the ridge in the particular way it comes in April, gentle and specific. His tail moved once weekly in the way it had moved at the end of every evening for 8 years, the small, final thumping of a dog who is even at the last telling you that things are all right. Then he was still. Silas, who was 15 and had known Briar his whole conscious life, dug the grave himself under the walnut sprouts at the base of the slope. He carved the stone himself over the course of 3 evenings with a chisel and a mallet, and the patience he had absorbed from watching his mother work Briar, the friend who never left. Nora sat beside that stone sometimes in the evenings of the years that followed and told him things about the dye and the oil and the grit, about May Calloway and Gideon Pruitt and Everett Marshall, about Judge Harlan standing in his courtroom and saying that he had been wrong, about Warren Holt at the base of the porch steps with his hat in his hands. She told him about Caleb, things she had not been able to say in the years immediately after, when the grief was still acute and had a specific shape. By now it had become something she carried the way you carry something that has been yours for a long time, not without weight, but with the particular ease of familiarity. You kept us going, she told the stone. When I didn't know if I could keep going, you were there. That is not nothing. That is everything. The wind moved through the walnut grove, through the new growth on the old stumps, and through the 12 seedlings she had planted in 1897, which were already showing the first signs of becoming something significant. A bird called somewhere across the valley. The slope was green in the particular way that slopes are green in Arkansas in spring, densely insistently, as though the ground is making an argument about abundance. In 1901, Gideon Pruitt milled the 6 remaining logs. Silas was 17 by then, at the age where a young man begins to understand that the world is going to require something specific of him and that he should start thinking about what he intends to offer. He was taller than Caleb had been with his mother's eyes and his great-great-grandfather's patience, and he stood in Gideon's workshop for an afternoon watching the logs go through the saw and emerge as boards of a quality that made Gideon stop work twice, simply to look at what he was producing. From those 6 logs, Gideon built one piece of furniture, a wardrobe large enough to hold everything a young man would need as he made his way into the world, built with the joinery and the wood selection that Gideon Pruitt brought to everything he made, intended to last 300 years, and built accordingly. On the inside of the wardrobe door, where you would see it only if you opened it and looked, he carved Ezra's words in the same letters he had carved on the headboard of Silas's bed 8 years earlier. The walnut tree gives 4 gifts. Never sell the whole tree when you can sell each part. Beneath it, Ezra Whitfield, 1849. For Silas Marsh, 1901. When Silas saw it, he ran his fingers along the letters the same way he had run them along the headboard letters at 8 years old. He was not a demonstrative young man. He had his mother's preference for action over expression, but his mother, watching from the doorway, saw something move across his face that she recognized. The specific expression of a person encountering something that was made for them, that has waited for them, that knows their name, even though it was begun before they were born. "It's good work," he said. "It is," she agreed. Nora Whitfield Marsh lived on the farm she had held against all reasonable expectation for the rest of her life. She was not famous. She was not written about in newspapers. She was known in Crawford County as the Walnut Woman, not the Witch Woman anymore, not since about 1892, and not the Marsh Widow, which had always been a label applied from outside by people who defined her by her loss, rather than by what she did with it. The Walnut Woman was a name she had earned through the work, and it described something real. She made dye and oil and grit, and eventually timber for 30 more years. She taught the process to Silas and to Silas's wife, and eventually to their children, careful and precise, the way May Calloway had taught her, not as a curiosity, but as a practice, as a thing you do, because it is worth doing, and because knowledge kept only in one head is always one accident away from being lost. She kept Ezra's journal on the kitchen table for the rest of her life. She read from it the way other people read from Scripture, not looking for information she didn't have, but re-encountering the truth of it in different seasons, finding that it meant something slightly different at 40 than it had at 29, and something different again at 60 than it had at 40. The 12 trees she planted in 1897 grew. They grew slowly, the way black walnut trees grow, with the seriousness of something that intends to last, putting down root before height, strengthening from below before extending above. By the time Nora was old, they were tall enough to shade the slope in the afternoons, and the walnuts they dropped each October were harvested by Silas's children with the same baskets, in the same cart, in the same routine she had developed in 1891. The same dye, the same oil, the same grit, the same patience. Nora died in the winter of 1931, 69 years old, in the walnut bed frame that Gideon Pruitt had built for Silas in 1893, and that Silas had given back to her when he married and moved to his own house, because he thought she should have it. She died with Silas beside her, and his children gathered around, and the winter light coming through the window that looked out onto the south-facing slope, where the 12 trees she had planted stood bare against the gray sky, their upper branches holding the precise architecture of things that have grown correctly and know it. She could see them from the bed. She looked at them for a long time before she closed her eyes. They buried her beside Caleb in the small cemetery behind the Crawford County Methodist Church, and on her headstone they carved the words she had requested, the words she had written in a letter to Silas years earlier, when she had first thought about such things and decided not to leave them to chance. She did not let the storm define her. She let patience do that. The 12 trees she planted in 1897 are still standing. They are more than 120 years old, and they stand on the south-facing slope above what is now the Marsh family property, which has remained in the family continuously since Ezra Whitfield planted the first grove in 1849. The descendants of Silas Marsh still harvest the walnuts each October. They still make dye and oil and grit from the husk and the meat in the shell. They still sell seasoned walnut timber to furniture makers who understand what they are buying. They keep Ezra's journal in a glass case in the front room of the farmhouse, and they can recite its central passage from memory the way other families recite prayers. In 1962, a professor from the University of Arkansas came to study the Marsh family's methods of air-drying walnut timber. He spent 3 weeks on the farm, measuring and testing and interviewing, and he published a paper that confirmed in the language of mid-century materials science what Ezra Whitfield had understood in 1849 and what Nora Whitfield Marsh had acted on in 1891, that air-dried walnut seasoned 18 to 24 months before milling is measurably more stable, more consistent in color, and superior in working properties to kiln-dried walnut processed at commercial speed. The paper was titled Traditional Methods of Timber Seasoning, a Case Study from Crawford County, Arkansas. In the acknowledgments, the professor thanked the Marsh family for preserving not only the trees, but the knowledge that made them valuable. In the final paragraph, he quoted the inscription that Gideon Pruitt had carved on the inside of a wardrobe door 61 years earlier. The words that Ezra had written and Nora had lived, and 5 generations had passed down. The walnut tree gives 4 gifts. Never sell the whole tree when you can sell each part. This is what Nora Whitfield Marsh understood from 31 fallen trees and 19 months of patience in a leather-bound journal left behind by a man who planted seeds he would never see harvest. The world will tell you that what is lying on the ground is worth nothing, that the time required to do the thing correctly is time you don't have, that the people offering you a quick exit from a difficult situation are doing you a favor, that a woman alone with stained hands and an unpayable debt in a grove full of fallen timber should take what is offered and be grateful. The world is wrong about this. It has always been wrong about this. It will continue to be wrong about this for as long as patience remains the thing that most people find most difficult, which is to say forever. Nora Whitfield Marsh believed when everyone doubted. She waited when everyone rushed. She refused the easy path not because she was reckless, but because she understood from Ezra's journal, from May Calloway's grandmother's words, from the specific gravity of her son's hand in hers, on the night the wind took everything, that the right path and the easy path are rarely the same path. And because she chose correctly, her great-great-grandfather's trees became her son's inheritance, and her grandchildren's practice, and her great-grandchildren's legacy, and the subject of a university paper, and the reason a professor thanked a family for keeping something alive. The husk became color. The meat became light. The shell became polish. The wood became furniture that outlasted everyone who made it. And the woman who stood in the wreckage with stained hands and a clear mind became someone that 5 generations of her family have tried to be worthy of. That is not nothing. That is everything.